Okay, so you want to hijack a ship, not steal a car, not rob a bank, an actual ocean-going vessel worth tens of millions of dollars, sailing through open water with a crew who has no gun and nowhere to run. You picture the moment, your skiff pulling alongside a supertanker, a rope ladder going up the hull, and somewhere in Europe or Asia, a shipping company suddenly very interested in talking to you. For a few weeks, you are the most powerful person on that ship, and the whole world is waiting on your phone call. Here's the problem. The ship you just took is worth $150 million, and you cannot sell it, dock it, refuel it, or drive it anywhere without the entire world's navies watching. So the paradox at the center of this business, the more valuable the thing you steal, the less you can do with it, until the only thing left to sell is time. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how much a hijacked oil tanker is actually worth to the people who took it. Why the ransom number on the news is never the number that reaches the guy in the skiff, and why the most dangerous job in the pirate economy isn't boarding the ship. It's guarding the money afterward. This is the economics of maritime piracy. And like everything on this channel, it ends with an invoice. Let's start with what it actually costs to become a pirate, because it is almost insultingly cheap. A used skiff, the small open speedboat you'll use to approach your target, runs somewhere around $2,000 to $4,000 secondhand on the Somali coast. A pair of outboard engines, ladders, and grappling hooks add maybe another $1,500. Fuel for a multi-day pursuit costs a few $100s more. Call the full starter kit somewhere around $5,000 to $10,000, split among a crew of 6 to 12 men. Compare that to the ship you're chasing, a Panamax bulk carrier or a Suezmax tanker moving through the Gulf of Aden can be worth anywhere from $30 million to over $150 million, cargo included. That ratio, a few $1,000s of equipment against tens of millions of dollars of target, is why piracy off the Horn of Africa exploded so fast between 2008 and 2011. It is, on paper, one of the highest leverage crimes on the planet. But leverage is not the same as profit, and this is where the dream picture starts to crack. First, you need financing, because a $5,000 boat crew rarely funds itself. Onshore investors, often based in coastal towns like Isle or Hijacking in Puntland, put up the cash for boats, weapons, and fuel in exchange for a fixed share of whatever ransom eventually comes in. Some of these financing arrangements were, according to researchers who studied the period, structured almost like informal stock exchanges, with locals literally buying shares in specific pirate operations. One widely reported case described a so-called pirate stock exchange in Hijacking, where investors could buy into a raid with cash, and even weapons and vehicles counted as in-kind investment. That means before a single ship is boarded, the ransom is already spoken for by people who never left dry land. Second cost, the mothership. Small skiffs can't survive open ocean for days, so pirate crews began hijacking fishing trawlers and small cargo dhows first, using them as floating bases hundreds of miles offshore. That mothership isn't purchased so much as stolen in a smaller, earlier crime, which means your very first heist is often just fuel for the second one. Third cost, the weight. A successful hijacking doesn't end when the ship stops moving. It starts a negotiation that historically averaged somewhere around 60 to 90 days, sometimes stretching past a year. Every one of those days you're feeding, guarding, and controlling a crew of hostages on a ship you don't know how to sail, anchored off a coastline with no port authority. You need cat, the mild stimulant leaf chewed constantly by pirate guards to stay alert during the standoff. And that alone can run a crew several $100s a week. You need extra gunmen brought in purely to prevent your own crew from being robbed or double-crossed by a rival group on shore. Yes, in this business, the single biggest threat to a pirate's payday is usually another pirate. So the entry cost was never really $10,000. It was $10,000 to start, and an unknown compounding daily cost to survive long enough to collect anything at all. Now the part everyone actually wants to know, how does the ransom money move, and how much of it survives the trip? The number that hits the news is almost never the number that gets split among the men on the boat. Start with the headline ransom, because Somali piracy at its peak in 2008 to 2011 generated ransoms estimated by researchers at somewhere between $339 million and $413 million total. Individual payouts ranged wildly. Some vessels were released for a few $100,000, others for well over $5 million. The 2008 hijacking of the Ukrainian cargo ship Faina, carrying battle tanks and military hardware, ended with a reported ransom of roughly $3.2 million after more than 4 months of negotiation. The Saudi supertanker Sirius Star, seized the same year loaded with roughly $100 million worth of crude oil, was released in January 2009 for a reported ransom of about $3 million, delivered by parachute onto the deck in a waterproof case. Notice the gap already: a $100 million cargo, a $3 million ransom. That's not generosity from the shipping company. It's the market price of an unsellable asset being negotiated down to whatever the pirates can actually enforce collection of. Now the ransom lands, and immediately, everyone with a claim on it lines up. The onshore financiers who fronted the boats and weapons typically take the largest cut first, often reported at 30 to 75% of the total, depending on the deal struck before the raid. Local elders, clan leaders, and so-called facilitators who negotiated safe passage or logistics take another slice, sometimes 10 to 20%. Interpreters and professional negotiators, because yes, this became professionalized enough to require negotiators, took fees as well, sometimes flat, sometimes a percentage. Then come the guards who actually held the hostages for months, often paid a flat daily rate rather than a share, because nobody trusts a guard's math when millions are on the table. By the time it reaches the men who actually climbed the rope ladder and took the initial risk, researchers studying the period estimated their cut at somewhere around 0.01 to 0.05% of the final ransom, in some cases just a few hundred to a few $1,000s each. Read that again. The boarding crew, the ones facing possible gunfire from private security or a naval helicopter, the ones actually committing the crime, often walked away with less than a junior clerk's monthly salary in the country they were robbing. The people who made the real money in Somali piracy, by nearly every serious study of the period, were never the pirates on the water. They were the financiers, the middlemen, and this is the part communities rarely wanted to hear, sometimes local officials who took a cut to look away. There's a second revenue leak almost nobody accounts for at the start. The ransom delivery itself is dangerous and expensive. Shipping companies hired private maritime security firms just to fly the cash in and negotiate the physical handover. And those firms charge fees that came out of the eventual payout's logistics, not the company's separate budget. Then there's currency and counting risk. Cash dropped in US $100 bills had to be verified on shore, sometimes with counterfeit detection devices, before anyone would agree the deal was actually done. Add insurance market pressure on top of all this. Kidnap and ransom insurance, the same product used for hostage-taking on land, expanded rapidly to cover ships transiting high-risk waters, and by around 2011, premiums for vessels crossing the Gulf of Aden had risen sharply, in some estimates by well over 10 times pre-crisis rates. That's a cost shipping companies pay whether or not they're ever hijacked, a tax the entire industry absorbs because of what a small number of crews off one coastline were doing. War risk insurance zones were redrawn to include the whole Gulf of Aden corridor, meaning every single ship passing through, hijacked or not, paid more just to exist in that stretch of water. Naval patrols followed the money too. Multinational task forces, including NATO and EU missions, spent hundreds of millions of dollars a year patrolling the same waters, a cost ultimately borne by taxpayers in a dozen countries, not by any single pirate. One widely cited estimate placed the total global cost of Somali piracy, ransoms, insurance, rerouting, security, naval operations combined, at somewhere around $6.6 to $6.9 billion in a single year at the peak, versus a few $100 million that ever reached anyone standing on Somali soil. For every dollar a pirate crew collected, The rest of the world was spending roughly $15 to $20 defending against the possibility of collecting it. That's not a criminal enterprise with a healthy margin. That's a very small, very risky toll booth sitting in the middle of an enormously expensive global overreaction, one that eventually worked. Because here's the mechanism that finally broke the model: armed guards. Once shipping companies began putting privately contracted armed security teams on board, a shift that accelerated sharply after 2011, no vessel with an armed team on deck was successfully hijacked, according to industry data from that period. That single change did more to end Somali piracy's golden years than any ransom negotiation or naval patrol. The revenue mechanic that made piracy briefly attractive, a cheap boat against an expensive, undefended ship, simply stopped existing once the ship stopped being undefended. By 2012, reported hijackings off the Horn of Africa had fallen by more than 90% from their peak just 3 years earlier. The business didn't get outlawed harder. It got outpriced. Case 1. The MV Faina, September 2008. A Ukrainian-operated cargo ship carrying 33 Soviet-era T-72 tanks, anti-aircraft guns, and ammunition, seized off the Somali coast by a pirate crew who, by their own admission later, had no idea what cargo they'd actually captured until they opened the hold. For a moment, this looked like the biggest score in pirate history: military hardware, global media attention, and a U.S. Navy warship shadowing the vessel offshore within days. The standoff lasted 134 days. During that time, the pirate crew reportedly grew to include additional gunmen brought in purely for security, each one an extra mouth that would need paying from the same eventual pot. The ship's owner also had to keep the original 20-man Ukrainian and Russian crew alive and fed for over 4 months, since a dead hostage collapses the entire negotiation. On February 5, 2009, the ransom was finally paid, roughly $3.2 million, reportedly delivered by parachute onto the ship's deck in a waterproof container. Split among an estimated 50 to 60 people who claimed some stake in the operation: financiers, guards, negotiators, reinforcements. That's an average of roughly $55,000 per claimant, before the largest shares were skimmed off the top by the 2 or 3 men who financed the raid. The original boarding crew, by most contemporary reporting on Somali piracy payout structures, likely cleared a few $1,000s each for 4.5 months of guarding a hostile crew on a ship loaded with tanks. One pirate spokesman quoted at the time claimed the crew would use their share to buy new boats for the next job, meaning the profit wasn't kept, it was reinvested straight back into more risk. The ship itself, once released, resumed its voyage to Kenya, delivering cargo that had been contracted for delivery over 4 months earlier. Insurance and legal costs on the shipping side, rarely reported publicly in exact figures, are estimated by maritime analysts to have added a further 7-figure sum on top of the ransom itself. So the real ledger, $3.2 million in, split more than 50 ways against 134 days of armed guarding, feeding 20 hostages and global naval attention. Per boarding pirate per day, the actual take likely worked out to less than $30. That's below minimum wage in nearly every country on Earth for a hostage standoff involving battle tanks. Case 2. The Sirius Star, November 2008. At 330 meters long, this was the largest vessel ever hijacked at the time. A Saudi-owned supertanker carrying roughly 2 million barrels of crude oil, worth somewhere around $100 million at the time of capture. It was seized more than 800 kilometers off the Kenyan coast, far beyond where naval patrols expected pirate activity, proving the crews were operating with motherships capable of striking deep into open ocean. The negotiation stretched about 2 months. In January 2009, a ransom reported at roughly $3 million was paid, again delivered by air onto the deck. As the cash-laden parachute came down, at least one witness account described a small boat capsizing in rough water while retrieving the payment, and several of the pirates aboard were reported to have drowned with the money. Read that twice. A portion of the entire ransom for the largest ship ever hijacked was lost at sea in the final 10 minutes of the operation, before anyone had even split it. The math on this one is almost absurd. A $100 million cargo produced a $3 million ransom, meaning the pirates captured roughly 3 cents on the dollar of the value physically inside the ship they controlled. That's because crude oil, unlike cash, is not something a pirate crew can offload. You cannot dock a stolen supertanker at a normal port, and no refinery will quietly buy 2 million barrels with no paperwork. So despite holding the single most valuable target in the history of the crime, the payout was smaller than several previous, far less dramatic hijackings. The lesson embedded in this case is one the entire pirate economy eventually had to learn. The ransom ceiling isn't set by what the ship is worth. It's set by what the shipping company's insurer is willing to pay to make the story end. Every additional day of delay burns money on both sides. For the pirates in food and guarding costs, for the shipping company in an idle asset and mounting insurance pressure, until both sides agree on a number neither of them finds satisfying. That equilibrium, in case after case throughout this period, landed consistently in the low single-digit millions, regardless of whether the cargo was worth $30 million or $150 million. The Sirius Star's owner eventually confirmed the ship and remaining crew were safely released, and the vessel returned to commercial service, its brief moment as the most famous hijacked object in the world, already fading from headlines. For the pirates who survived the retrieval, the actual per-person payout on the biggest ship they'd ever taken was, by most reconstructions, comparable to or smaller than the Faina job 2 months earlier. Case 3. The Maersk Alabama, April 2009. The case that became a movie, and the one where the economics finally collided with force. 4 pirates boarded the U.S.-flagged container ship, but the crew fought back, disabling the engine, and in the chaos, taking control of the vessel before the pirates could fully secure it. One pirate ended up in a lifeboat with the ship's captain, Richard Phillips, as a hostage, while the other 3 remained nearby, and a U.S. Navy destroyer arrived within a day. This wasn't a multi-month standoff over a stationary tanker. It was a 5-day chase and negotiation happening in real time, with a hostage in an enclosed lifeboat and a warship close enough to act. On the 5th day, U.S. Navy SEAL snipers fired 3 simultaneous shots, killing 3 of the pirates instantly. The 4th, a teenager reported to be 18 or 19 years old, named Abdulwali Moose, had already left the lifeboat to negotiate and was taken into custody. He was flown to the United States, prosecuted in federal court in New York, and in 2011 sentenced to 33 years and 9 months in federal prison. Total ransom collected in this case, $0. Total revenue for the 4 men who boarded, $0. Total cost to the pirates, 3 lives and 1 multi-decade federal sentence for an operation that generated no payout at all. This is the case that belongs in every version of this story, because it's the one that shows the other side of the ledger, the version where the entry cost is paid in full and the revenue line simply never arrives. It's also the case that accelerated the shift toward armed escorts and naval response teams being pre-positioned along the corridor, since it proved international forces could and would intervene directly, not just patrol from a distance. For every Faina or Sirius Star that ended in a paid ransom, there were operations like this one that ended in gunfire, a prison cell, and a story turned into a Hollywood film starring someone else's face, not the pirates. Nobody licenses that film to the man serving the sentence. The economics of piracy include this outcome as a real recurring line item, not the exception, the tax. Case 4, the financier, not the boarder, Mohamed Abdi Hassan, known widely by the nickname Afweyne, one of the men widely described in reporting as a founding figure of organized piracy financing in Puntland. Unlike the young men who climb rope ladders, Afweyne reportedly never boarded a single ship himself. He was accused of organizing financing, recruiting crews, and taking a cut of ransoms across multiple hijackings during piracy's peak years, allegedly amassing a personal fortune while operating largely in the open, even giving interviews to journalists. In 2013, he announced he was retiring from piracy and was later lured to Belgium under the pretense of discussing a film project and a supposed peace initiative. Belgian authorities arrested him on arrival. He was prosecuted in Belgium for his role in the 2009 hijacking of a Belgian-flagged dredging vessel, the Pompey, and its crew. In 2016, a Belgian court convicted him and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. This is the closest the pirate economy came to prosecuting the actual profit center of the business, rather than just the labor. It's also, notably, one of the only cases in this entire story where a person widely believed to have captured a genuinely large, multi-year share of ransom income received a sentence anywhere close to the boarding crews who made a few $1,000s each. For years, the men actually risking gunfire on the water were the ones most likely to end up dead, imprisoned, or both, while the men financing the operations from a hotel or a compound on shore mostly kept their money and their freedom. Afweyne's conviction was less a routine case and more a rare exception the system managed to catch. Most of the financiers of Somali piracy's peak years were never extradited, never tried, and never asked to return a single dollar of what they took. So even inside a criminal economy where almost nobody profits, the boarding crew doesn't, the mid-level guards don't, the very top layer of financiers largely did, right up until one very unusual court case in Brussels. That asymmetry, maximum risk at the bottom, maximum reward and minimum accountability at the top, isn't unique to piracy. It's just unusually visible here, because for a few years, the whole world was watching a coastline in the Horn of Africa closely enough to actually see it happen. So here's the invoice. The Faina crew, roughly $3.2 million collected, split more than 50 ways, netting the actual boarding pirates an estimated few $1,000s each for 134 days of armed guarding, a real wage of under $30 a day before CAT, reinforcements, and mothership costs are even subtracted. The Sirius Star crew, a $100 million cargo, produced a $3 million ransom, a chunk of which was lost at sea during the handover itself, leaving the men who actually held the largest ship ever hijacked with a payout smaller than most office jobs pay in a year. The Maersk Alabama crew, 0 ransom, 3 men shot dead on day 5, 1 man alive to face 33 years and 9 months in a U.S. federal prison, a multi-decade sentence for an operation with no revenue line at all. Afweyne, the financier, an estimated fortune built across years of ransoms he never personally boarded a ship to collect, followed by 20 years in a Belgian prison after 1 lured trip to discuss a movie deal. Add the invisible line items nobody puts in the ransom headline. Years spent living under naval blockade conditions in coastal towns that became international pariah ports. The cost of cot, food, and reinforcements eaten daily out of a payout that hadn't even arrived yet. The interpreters, negotiators, and local officials who took a cut before a single boarding pirate saw a dollar. The mothership itself stolen in an earlier unpaid crime just to make the real crime possible. The drowned share of a ransom that never even made it to shore. The near total absence of any pirate on this list who died wealthy, retired quietly, or kept what he took. Meanwhile, the rest of the world spent an estimated $6.6 to $6.9 billion in a single peak year on insurance, rerouting, and naval patrols. $15 to $20 spent defending against piracy for every $1 that ever reached a pirate's hands. And the single policy change that ended the golden years wasn't a bigger ransom crackdown or a smarter negotiation. It was putting a few armed guards on deck, after which no defended ship was successfully taken. Again, the industry didn't out-argue piracy, it outpriced it. For a few years off one coastline, a handful of men made global headlines proving that you could steal a $150 million object with a $5,000 boat. What the headlines left out is that almost none of those men ever got to keep what the headlines said they took. The financiers collected, the middlemen collected, the insurers and navies spent billions defending against the idea of it. And the man who actually climbed the ladder was, more often than not, working for less than minimum wage, on borrowed time, in a business that ends in a cell or a coffin far more often than a payday. The ship was never the prize. It was just the receipt for how much it cost to learn that the hardest part of piracy was never taking the money. It was keeping it.